Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info.
We'll send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
Hello. Today we are talking about patterns. If we look at our permaculture flower, it is itself a pattern, indicating growth and expansion and interconnection between each of these different petals. Pattern touches on many of these disciplines: land and nature stewardship, building, tools and technology, education, culture, health and well-being, finances, economics, land tenure, and community governance. There are patterns here that are physical, patterns that are cultural, patterns that move through time. In each of these, a building itself is usually built on a pattern, for example. So we will explore that more in this slideshow. I'm here with William Faith and Milton Dixon.
Hello.
Hello.
And I'd like to point out that the permaculture flower itself, if we look at it, are patterns within patterns.
How so?
Well, in the center, you've got this sort of lobed pattern. You've got circular pattern around that. You have a spiraling pattern coming out from there, and then the petals themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the intersection of all these different patterns that we end up using. Mm-hmm. The combination, the synergy between them.
That's right. So to help us get thinking about pattern, we're looking at this tile mosaic. Pattern is, we can think of it as embedded information, and we recognize and use patterns all the time. We know that something is a pattern because it repeats itself. We see that in this tile mosaic. It has variations. We can see that between, these sort of diamond shapes in the top with the smaller pieces, and then, the row of white and blue, and then more diamond shapes, but, smaller again. And also the sort of circular patterns in the bottom two layers that are mimicking each other, right? So we play with pattern all the time.
As I mentioned in the initial slide, one of the things we deal with is the intersections between patterns and the almost the concrete units that they create in and of themselves, and that's known as tessellization. Mm-hmm. So you can consider in this example the blue line through the middle. There's three blue lines that go through the whole thing. That could be a complete unit. It could be all the white pieces. It could be a single tile. It could be a group of tiles that are the same color. I'm looking at the yellow surrounding kind of that maroon. So we're looking for the wholes that are made by these different patterns,
which in and of themselves can compose patterns.
Okay, so pattern is important because it helps us navigate the physical world, this world that has time and space continuum, right? So patterns emerge because they help to solve particular kinds of problems, specifically problems between the flow of energy from one area to another, and how materials transform themselves. So we're always paying attention to that in our systems. How are the materials cycling? How is the energy flowing? And we're working with patterns that nature has worked out over so many billions of years. So the thing to note in the hurricane here, and also in the leaf, is that these patterns that we see, they have energy, movement, there are edges and connections, and orders of magnitude.
I look at each of these patterns through two lenses. One is that there's a cause to each pattern, and we might need to take account of that. There's also an effect to each pattern, which we might also want to take account of. Sometimes maybe both, but sometimes it'll be one or the other. For example, the cause might be the movement of the tectonic plates and earthquakes, but the effects are going to be the shape of the land and the way water flows on the land.
And then from a design perspective, understanding pattern is key to design, because when we can identify patterns for what they are and what their purpose is, at that point we start to develop a common language in a design perspective, which if we think about patterns in biology or in architecture, it's the same things. You'll develop a certain pattern language, if you will, to identify and use these things effectively.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at the next slide and sort of tease that out a little bit. One of our aims as designers is to be able to recognize the different patterns that we see in the landscape at all different levels, whether it's this frog on the left or this alpine meadow on the right.
But if we look at the function of the pattern on the left with the frog, obviously this allows them to blend in with the landscape, to be able to avoid predation and hunt more effectively.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about this pattern on the right, we could look at each individual piece and figure out why it manifests as it does in the world. The mountains are a pattern. The valley itself, as Milton was saying in the last slide, it has its pattern of ridges and slopes and valleys. The tree line is a pattern that exists for a particular reason. The flowering and the colors and the patterns in the flowering plants all represent patterns that have particular strategies that these plants are trying to solve or that are caused by certain physical elements in the world, right? Like wind or water.
That the plants are taking advantage of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so part of our job as designers, as Milton was saying, is to figure out what is the cause of the patterns that we're seeing, what are the patterns that we're seeing, and then, as William was saying, learn how to use what we see to push the whole system in the direction that we would like to see it unfold, or that would represent a positive, regenerative, healthy pattern. So to get into the nitty-gritty of this, we're looking at several patterns here. These aren't all of the patterns we find in nature, but there's some of them. So we see the jellyfish are in sort of a scatter pattern. And that's effective when you're thinking about a predator approaching. Where do they focus, right? A scatter pattern helps disperse either predator attention and focus, or if this were seeds and pollen, it would also be perhaps in a scatter pattern. Again, the plant using that strategy, that pattern, in order to have a better chance of having the seed land somewhere that it can grow well. So scatter pattern is an example. This crackle pattern to the right in the top middle, crackle pattern represents expansion and contraction. This could be mud, or we could imagine it being skin that has to expand and contract. The egg pattern is an important one. The web or net pattern collects information, collects materials. The branching pattern we see in this acacia tree is so common not only to trees and plant, especially woody plants, but also to lungs and riverways, and solves a particular kind of problem in the world. And the sort of undulating serpentine pattern on the bottom left has its own functions. So again, our job is to recognize these, to have working command of the, knowledge of them, so that we can use them in our design work.
Something I would point out with the jellyfish photo as well is, even though they're arranged in a scatter pattern, their bodies themselves have a lobular pattern, so which allows them to propel themselves through the water. So these are sort of patterns within patterns if you're actually looking carefully.
Okay, and this next slide, again, is just using an example of patterns solve problems in the physical world. So this left picture is of this branch where there are leaves distributed to maximize photosynthesis. So we can see that by arranging the little leaves in a spiraling pattern around this branch, you can actually get maximum photosynthesis, and it seems chaotic, but it's actually very orderly and functional. Whereas in the bottom, you see how much space it takes to organize the same amount of material in a linear fashion.
It's completely chaotic in its order. It serves no function other than to appease our need for order. Whereas the other one, not only does it effectively collect sunlight, but it also distributes water and other minerals to the individual needles.
And understanding patterns in these contexts really kind of explain how life arranges itself. And in that respect, it gives us a broader understanding of how things work on the small scale all the way out into larger systems. Because these individual elements, the tree, the honeycomb, they're using natural patterns to solve their own problems.
Mm-hmm. So the honeycomb pattern is solving the problem of how do we use the minimum amount of material to create the strongest structure. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that applied in a human environment where we've taken that sort of same hexagonal pattern and used it in an architectural application. That's the kind of thinking and design work we want to be applying. For the image on the right, where we have this snake with its serpentine movement, one long spine, lots of vertebrae moving. We have the same sort of serpentine pattern in the bottom. This wall is one brick thick, but able to stand, and it's sturdy. It creates a lot of niches and visual interest. And it can stand and be a minimal amount of material at one brick thick because it uses that serpentine pattern.
Definitely more visually appealing than a flat wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also interacting with the wind in a different way, the environment altogether.
And people.
Mm-hmm. In this next slide, we see we want to pay attention as permaculture designers and practitioners, not only to physical patterns, but also to temporal ones, patterns in time. So on the left, we see this wheel of the year divided into 8 parts with traditional ways of celebrating and activities and regulating human culture, in this case more in conjunction with the natural world in that way. And we all have those elements in our culture if we look how we divide the year up and how we work with patterns in time with our culture. On the right, we have an illustration of something called phenology. And phenology is the recognition that that human cultures have ways of measuring and of recognizing the timing in nature through certain patterns. So these 3 pictures, the squirrel, the oak, and the corn, are related because there's a saying that in Tennessee that you plant your corn when the oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear. Right? Those are specific indicators from nature about when it's time to do something. And that is backed up by science, but it's a pattern we can observe.
And it's different than saying this date. This particular date is when you plant your corn. That might change depending upon the patterns of the weather that particular season. But the oak leaves are probably going to be a better indicator.
Mm-hmm. And it turns out the oak leaves come out at this time because the soil temperature is at the right temperature for them to succeed, to know that they're going to go ahead. And that's why the corn is more successful.
And to this, I would add that pattern recognition also plays a key role in this, in recognizing even the patterns that we observe outside of the natural system. Just if we think about the 40-hour work week, the 8-hour work day, the patterns that we observe in going to and from a job or a place in the day. We're actually following a lot of patterns, even if we're not intrinsically aware of, but they're always out there. Finding those patterns and recognizing them and altering them as need be is also key.
Okay, so patterns in time. What we're looking at here on the left is a lava field in an area, and we can see the first plants coming back into this area in succession. And what we want to do is recognize how succession works ecologically or culturally. A new organization, how does it develop its culture? Can we intervene and push it toward a richer, more dynamic, more functional place by using patterns in time and pushing succession, which is when we get toward the picture on the right. And we've been alluding to this, but here it is before us, that there are also many patterns in culture and invisible structure, whether that's patterns that we go through in a lifetime, cultural patterns around marriage and birth and death, and different rites of passage throughout a human's life. And then patterns that we have culturally about care of the young and care of the elderly or the ill. And we want to be finding and implementing cultural patterns and practices that make us healthier and more resilient.
Indeed, finding the different patterns in society. What are the things that drive us to be together? What are the patterns around that? What are our patterns in time of crisis? What are our patterns in terms of celebration? How do we gather and why?
Mm-hmm.
Largely, we go through life and we're completely unaware of these patterns, or only remotely. But really, stopping to at least build an awareness of them gives us the opportunity then to make changes.
Mm-hmm. Just as we have inherited landscapes that are disturbed or damaged, we have inherited cultures, for the most part, many of us, cultures that are also not intact. So we want to aim for how do we make them more healthy, more whole. So here we are back again at our permaculture flower, and we've been able to look at some pretty amazing things when it comes to pattern and how the universe and life are organized by pattern. They act out patterns in time, whether that's weekly or monthly or yearly patterns. And humans also have these patterns that we have developed through our cultures, and given us some hint of what we might be identifying, how to think about using pattern in problem solving, and creating an image and vision for something more complete.